Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Brianna Parent-Long. I'm really excited to be with you all today, and I will be introducing the wonderful minister. This session is part of the Together Ensemble 2023 conference, which is Canada's national gathering on the Sustainable Development Goals. This year's conference runs over the course of 3 days from June 7th to the 9th, in person at 5 sites across the country, as well as online, to bring Canada's SDG communities together across all sectors. We are pleased to be hosting today's event at Carleton University, which is on the unceded and traditional land of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin peoples, as part of a broader national gathering. We welcome the rest of Canada into our conversation today for this session through the Together Ensemble online broadcast. The Honourable Karina Gould was first elected as a Member of Parliament for Burlington in 2015. She has previously served as Minister of International Development and Minister of Democratic Institutions. A graduate of McGill University and the University of Oxford, Minister Gould is passionate about helping Canadian families, public service, and international development. Before her election as the Member of Parliament for Burlington, she worked as a trade and investment specialist for the Mexican Trade Commission in Toronto, a consultant for the Migration and Development Program at the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C., and spent a year volunteering at an orphanage in Mexico. Minister Gould has deep roots in her hometown of Burlington, Ontario, and is an active member of the community and an advocate for families, women's issues, and affordable housing. She has volunteered with and actively supports the Iroquois Bruce Trail Club, the Burlington chapter of the Canadian Federation of University Women, the Mississauga Furniture Bank, Halton Women's Place, and other local organizations. Minister Gould lives in Burlington with her husband Alberto and their son Oliver. With the birth of Oliver, Minister Gould became the first woman federal cabinet minister to give birth while holding office. She is passionate about breaking down barriers for women, youth, and underrepresented groups, and it is an absolute pleasure to introduce you and have you here with us.
Thank you so much, Brianna, for that very kind introduction. And I have to say, it's really nice to be at Carleton. It's been a while because of the pandemic, but it's really great to be back and to be with all of you today. And it's really nice to know that there are folks joining from across the country. I think this is a really neat way that we're doing Together Ensemble, trying to have insight, in-person opportunities as well as online opportunities. And hopefully that means we're reaching a very broad segment of the Canadian population and that it's more inclusive for everyone. I have to say it's really a privilege to be joining you again this year. And I'd also like to echo the territorial acknowledgement and say that I'm grateful that we can gather here on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I recognize that people are joining from many sacred lands across this country. As the federal minister responsible for the national implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs, I have spent a good deal of time over the past few years thinking about what they mean. Les objectifs de développement durable sont un appel global à l'action pour relever les défis sociaux, économiques et environnementaux les plus urgents d'aujourd'hui. Comme nous le savons, les 17 objectifs portent sur des sujets aussi variés que l'approvisionnement en eau potable, l'utilisation rationnelle des terres agricoles ou la garantie de l'égalité de traitement des personnes dans la société. Mais pour moi, personnellement, il s'agit aussi de traiter notre planète de manière responsable et de ne pas prendre plus que ce dont nous avons besoin, afin que la Terre puisse soutenir l'humanité et qu'elle soit encore là pour nos enfants et nos petits-enfants. Cela signifie qu'il faut faire preuve de légèreté lorsque nous marchons et vivons tous ensemble. After the difficulties of the past few years, the 2030 Agenda provides us with a hopeful perspective for building a better world together. And indeed, I would say, as we can kind of taste the smoke in the air from the wildfires, that the SDGs just don't seem, or they seem more important than ever today. It's about all of us looking inward and saying, how can we achieve these objectives together? We're at the halfway mark of the 2030 Agenda. And as a country, we've made important progress in reaching the SDGs, but we know that there's much more work to do. The United Nations High-Level Political Forum in July offers us an important opportunity to mark that progress and share our next steps with Canadians and with the world. I will have the opportunity to present Canada's second Voluntary National Review, or VNR. It speaks to what Canadians have accomplished since our last VNR in 2018, but it also speaks to the work we have ahead of us. Over the last year, many organizations, governments, and individual Canadians participated in the online consultations, and I want to thank those attending today who shared their input. It was invaluable and helped inform the response we'll be presenting at the United Nations. Through the VNR, we evaluate progress made towards achieving all 17 SDGs, with a focus on efforts to advance 5 national priorities: SDG 1, no poverty; SDG 4, quality education; SDG 5, gender equality; SDG 13, climate action; and SDG 17, partnerships for the goals. And we've made significant progress in each of these areas, especially on SDG 1, which is about reducing poverty. In fact, through programs like the Canada Child Benefit, Canada has exceeded its interim target of a 20% reduction in poverty. Canada's poverty rate in 2021 was 7.4%, nearly half the 2015 rate, which was 14.5%. In 2021, there were close to 2.3 million fewer Canadians living in poverty compared to 2015, including 653,000 fewer children. However, new challenges arising from inflation, high housing prices, and global economic instabilities caused by the pandemic and the war in Ukraine are putting pressure on household income. Le gouvernement du Canada continuera à faire des investissements importants par le biais des programmes sociaux ciblés et d'aide aux revenus, et nous sommes déterminés à atteindre l'objectif d'une réduction de 50% de la pauvreté d'ici 2030 par rapport au niveau de 2015. Le Canada a également réalisé de grands progrès en ce qui concerne l'ODD 4, qui porte sur la qualité de l'éducation. Tout récemment, le gouvernement du Canada a fait un investissement historique de 30 milliards de dollars sur 5 ans pour mettre en place un système pan-canadien d'éducation préscolaire et de garde d'enfants abordable, de qualité et inclusif. Depuis avril de cette année, 6 provinces et territoires offrent des services de garde d'enfants réglementés pour une moyenne de 10 dollars par jour ou moins, et toutes les autres provinces et territoires ont réduit les frais d'au moins 50%. And we remain focused on creating 250,000 new childcare spaces across the country by March 2026, and growing and supporting the early childhood education workforce. These investments are also helping to advance gender equality by giving women and their families more flexibility in their choices, and removing barriers for mothers to participate in the workforce if they so choose. And in fact, as of last fall, Canada had the highest female workforce participation in Canada's history, in part thanks to our early learning and childcare initiative. Canadian educational outcomes are among the highest in the world. Provinces and territories are working to support students, parents, and education staff with academic assistance and ensuring student well-being. However, the pandemic disrupted education for learners around the world, and those living in extreme poverty, particularly girls and people with disabilities, are often left the furthest behind. In my previous role as Minister of International Development, I had the opportunity to launch the Together for Learning, a 3-year international campaign to promote quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for children and youth who are refugees or forcibly displaced and in a host community. We must continue to address issues of access, quality, equity, and accountability in global education. And Canada is committed to using innovative approaches and engaging partners to ensure that the hardest groups have access to safe, quality, inclusive education and skills training. Our international contributions are guided by priorities for action identified in Canada's feminist foreign policy and our feminist international assistance policy. I understand you had a conversation about FIAP earlier today. As I mentioned, when I was Minister of International Development, FIAP was near and dear to my heart, and it remains so, even if I'm not in that role. And Canada believes that peace, prosperity, and human rights are essential for results across all SDGs. We also support the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development, which is the primary financing framework for implementing the 2030 Agenda. These investments are part of our commitment to global action, but we're also showing high-level leadership, with Prime Minister Trudeau currently serving as co-chair of the UN Sustainable Development Goals Advocates Group with Prime Minister Motley of Barbados. Bien que le Canada ait progressé sur un certain nombre d'ODD, d'autres nécessitent encore une action contenue et concertée. De nouvelles initiatives et des activités notables contribuent également à faire progresser plusieurs ODD à la fois. Chaque ODD est unique et l'efficacité de nos actions dépend de notre capacité à collaborer et à penser de manière inclusive dans tous les domaines. Le Canada continue de constater des inégalités en matière de santé pour de nombreuses populations, avec des écarts importants et bien documentés dans les résultats de santé des populations autochtones. Les statistiques continuent de montrer l'ampleur et l'impact de l'inégalité des genres. Cela affecte à son tour notre capacité à progresser sur d'autres ODD. Canada's VNR acknowledges these challenges and speaks to them. While progress on poverty reduction in Canada remains generally positive, the impacts of COVID-19 and recent increases to the cost of living are not yet fully known. And as Canada continues its recovery from the pandemic, it is adapting its poverty reduction efforts to ensure that social protection systems are sufficiently meeting people's needs. These kinds of challenges truly demonstrate how working together is more important than ever. All levels of government, the private sector, the social sector, and individual citizens all have a role to play. Conferences like this one help us fulfill the last SDG, number 17, which is all about partnerships. It is a reminder that the SDGs aren't just for governments. Everyone in Canada can be a change maker. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Kitchener, Ontario for the grand opening of the SDG Idea Factory, a space that brings together organizations, peoples, and ideas. The Idea Factory will support the development of new startups and small businesses focused on social and environmental innovation. Black Youth Helpline, for example, is a nationwide charitable organization that delivers direct services and drives initiatives focused on prevention of social breakdown across populations of the most vulnerable children, youth, and families. And the Canadian Urban Libraries Council serves more than 8 million active users who annually visit more than 700 libraries and use its virtual services. In 2019, member public libraries loaned over 200 million items and had more than 560 million users in person and online. This conference is an opportunity for us to come together and share the excellent examples of things that each of you are doing, as academics, as industry folks, municipal leaders, and young people. Le Canada s'est engagé à continuer à mener des actions de sensibilisation et à maintenir un dialogue permanent avec l'ensemble de la société sur l'agenda 2030. Guidé par notre stratégie nationale pour l'agenda 2030, le gouvernement soutiendra le travail des partenaires et des parties prenantes pour entreprendre des initiatives innovantes afin de progresser les ODD. Nous avons déjà investi dans des actions de collaboration sur les ODD. Nous avons versé 22 millions de dollars dans le cadre du programme de financement des ODD à 131 projets et organisations autochtones et nationales. Le programme a créé de nombreuses possibilités de participation pour les Canadiens. En fait, la conférence d'aujourd'hui bénéficie plusieurs années du programme de financement des ODD. Avec le soutien du programme de financement des ODD et en partenariat avec le British Columbia Council for International Cooperation, Coopération Canada a produit 10 notes d'orientation décrivant les normes émergentes et les bonnes pratiques en ce qui concerne la plupart des aspects de la mise en œuvre de l'Agenda 2030. Succeed Social Enterprises makes use of links with educators and schools to create a learning experience for elementary students grades 3 to 6 to raise awareness of the SDGs. And when we think about the world through the lens of the SDGs, I think we should all feel inspired, empowered, and hopeful. There is exceptional work happening in Canada and around the world, and we have an opportunity to shape how the future will look. Our government remains steadfast in its commitment to enabling and accelerating progress to achieve the SDGs. But this will continue to take a whole of society approach. We will continue to need your energy, your ideas, and your action. And so I have no doubt that you're doing this today, but let's continue to inspire each other and inspire others to work together to achieve our goals. We have to continue to take action, to be ambitious, to celebrate our successes, apply lessons learned, and address our challenges. In 2030, my son will be 12 years old, and I often think about the legacy of what we're leaving him and his peers around the world. I am optimistic that together we can build stronger, safer, more inclusive communities that leave no one behind. Thank you. Merci.
While everyone's getting mic'd, I'll just introduce myself again. My name's Volupti Corliss, and I'm a senior advisor to the United Nations and also a member of CADIP, the Canadian Association of International Development Professionals. I'm so pleased to be able to moderate a panel today with the minister and our other wonderful guests. While everyone's coming up, I'll just introduce them really quickly. To the, what is that, right, left? Left of the minister. Yeah, exactly. The other, my other right. To the left of the minister is Caitlin Herchak. Caitlin is the Indigenous Governor, an Indigenous Governance Officer at VIDEA. And she has done she's doing her master's in geography at the University of Victoria right now. Her research is centering on the Maasai and traditional economies and community. She's also the co-host of and the creator of a podcast called Spilling Labrador Tea Under Cedar Trees. So I would encourage you all to listen to that and to hear what that's about. I'm curious already. Beside Caitlin, we have Shannon Kinderay, who's the Chief Operations Officer at the Cooperation Canada. Shannon's well known in our international communities as a leader. She's also an adjunct professor here at the University of Carleton, and she previously worked as a senior analyst for the Canadian International Development Platform. And finally, at the end of the row there on the left, we have Dr. Teddy Sammy. Dr. Sammy has been a partner and collaborator, co-conspirator on this fantastic event, and we're so grateful to NIPSIA for welcoming us here today. As a professor of international affairs and also the director here at NIPSIA. Dr. Sammy, his research interests are very broad, from women's economic empowerment to fragile states to domestic resource mobilization, income inequality and trade. Fascinating person to talk to. And his most recent book is Exiting the Fragility Trap, Rethinking Our Approach to the World's Most Fragile States. So another book I'll encourage you all to look up and get familiar with. So I'm going to come over there now and moderate the session. Is this mic on now, Mike? Our mic man, his name is Mike, so makes it easy. And I do just want to point out that it was not intentional that I picked a chair that's higher than all of you. We did have a conversation on the fact that I would end up in the middle on a higher chair, so I just want there to be no question about the fact that it was by accident. We just didn't have another fancy club chair. So I'm going to start by turning it over to Caitlin and Shannon. The first question that I'm going to ask is how can, especially given that we have the minister here, how can the government of Canada help localize the SDGs?
Well, thank you for
Start
the
with you, Shannon.
question. I think you can hear me okay. It's a pleasure to be with you here today, Minister, and with the rest of our esteemed guests. One of the things I was thinking about in terms of the localization agenda is to really ask ourselves, what do we actually mean by localizing the SDGs? Do we mean ensuring that there's funding for local community organizations to carry this forward? Do we mean engagement with municipalities? Do we mean engagement with provinces, with Indigenous communities? You know, in the international cooperation space, when we talk about localization, we're actually talking about shifting power. We're talking about power in the hands of those that are most impacted by our efforts, those who have the knowledge, the ownership, the capacities to dream up and implement the future that they want to see. And so when I think about the role of the Government of Canada in this, it really does become a bit of a question around how do we concretely shift power? What are the tools? What are the mechanisms to do that? When I think about it from an international cooperation perspective, I do think of it from the perspective of money going more directly into organizations and communities, recognizing that we all have different roles to play. And I think one of the pieces where the rubber hits the road is that we go from these quite lofty shifting power, localizing, to actually pretty mechanical and technical pieces, right? I mean, we're talking about how do we assess risk? How do we actually get money out the door? What are the reporting requirements for our partners? So we go from these broad kind of political agendas right through the technical. And I think where this government has an opportunity to advance, I think, is really around ensuring that link from those high level commitments flows through to the actual way we work and the way that we actually deliver assistance. And as many of you may know, the Global Affairs Canada is in a process of transforming how they deliver grants and contribution agreements. And I guess just really emphasizing how important that process will be for setting an example for other parts of the department and how other parts of the government rather, and how they think about implementing, but how the need to hold space for the way that we shift power and change how we work collectively is so important for a technical process of that nature to then enable more localized realization of the SDGs.
I love the change in language around from empowerment to shifting power. It's just a really different perspective on the importance of putting power in other people's hands. Thanks. Caitlin, over to you. What do you think?
Thank you. Shannon and I are besties, so building off that, I'm actually on the board for Cooperation Canada too. I'm the board baby, and like really getting to the heart of it is decolonization, right? And like recognizing that localization, decolonization, reconciliation, these things are relatives. Like when I say relatives, I mean like cousins. Like that's the way I think about them, right? And really recognizing that Indigenous people, like we need to be seen as like partners and leaders in sustainable development, or that smoke is gonna get a heck of a lot more thick, right? It's gonna be a lot thicker if we don't actually see each other as equals and want to work in relationship with each other. And I think at the end of the day, like all of us want the same things for our families and our communities. And really supporting Indigenous knowledge and resurgence is going to be a very helpful tool later down the road. And like rethinking of what is SDG, right? What is an SDG for an Indigenous person? For myself, it's learning my language, right? It situates myself in the territory that I'm on. I'm a guest on this territory. I'm actually Inuk from northern Quebec and Rankin Inlet Nunavut, and I have to be very mindful and like thankful for the host nations for allowing us to gather here today and have these conversations, and hoping that more host nations will be present in these conversations because we're conducting this work on their territory, on their land. So we need to be in good relationship with each other.
Thank you. I think that the whole issue of colonization is so important here at home, but also in Canada's role internationally. There are many countries that have been colonized, and there are many people whose voices we need to shift power to for the next stretch, I guess, towards the 2030 agenda. That's so true. I'm going to shift and ask my second question to Minister Gould and to Teddy. And that is, where should our investment focus be from your perspective in the SDG? Where should we be focusing our investments? And I hope, Minister, it's okay to start with you first.
Yeah, sure. Well, maybe just building off the first two comments, in the sense that, I think when we talk about localizing the SDGs, it's how do you talk about SDGs in a way that makes sense to people on the ground as well, right? Because I think if you say sustainable development goals, it doesn't always resonate, right, in terms of, but when you say what we're trying to achieve with that, right, and you talk about the goals in themselves, and then how do you ensure that those resources are available on the ground for people to make those empowered decisions and to actually build that future that they want. I mean, I think those are some of the things that we need to think about. And to Caitlin's point, like, we actually can't achieve the SDGs if we don't move forward on reconciliation, right? Like, we are not going to achieve any of them if Indigenous peoples are not full partners at the table and fully, empowered to make the decisions that are right for their communities. And you're right, we all want, like, at the end of the day, humans all want the same things, right? It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter where you come from. We want safety and security for our families, and we want opportunity for them to be healthy and to thrive, right? And so how do we ensure all of that? And so I think when it comes to, making these investments, I've had the unique perspective of being both the Minister of International Development and working on Canada's Agenda 2030 internationally, and now being the domestic minister responsible for our National Action Plan on SDGs. And I think what it comes down to is saying, are we making the investments towards the objectives that we're trying to attain, right? And, some of the points that I quoted, right? I mean, in terms of reduction in child poverty, like, it's astounding what we've been able to achieve in the last 7.5 years in Canada. It doesn't mean there aren't kids still living in poverty and we don't need to do more, but the fact that we've made that huge leap is something I think we need to recognize. And then we need to understand, like, that was a policy intervention that worked, right? Maybe we need to be doing more of that, right? And so, like, let's take a serious look at where are those interventions that have had a real significant impact, and let's do more of that. My goodness, on, just the environment and climate change, like, if, I know there are folks joining from around the country, and I don't know if there's a single province right now that doesn't have wildfires, right? This is unprecedented. And like it, for me, it's just the justification and the reasoning of why making investments in protecting our environment and fighting climate change and the clean energy transition are so unbelievably vital and important right now, because we're not going to be able to meet any of those other objectives if we don't have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink, right? And so if, for me, it's making that investment in the clean energy transition, making that investment in reducing poverty, those are two of the top ones for me. They're all important, right? So.
And making those investments at home in the
And
policies
abroad,
that are
yeah.
working, and then taking those innovations abroad.
And I mean, one of the things that I'm most proud of from my time as Minister of International Development was the doubling of Canada's climate financing, right? It, like, again, when you have, young people and Indigenous activists on the front lines of the climate crisis around the world, we need to be supporting them and their voices and their actions, because they know what their community needs, right? And, all of that fits within the Feminist International Assistance Policy, which I wasn't minister at the time, but I was parliamentary secretary when that was launched, and, really heavily involved in the consultations. But, it's those interventions and the leadership that Canada can demonstrate both at home and internationally that I think is so important. And we're seeing the change happen, right? Like, that's also what's exciting. And, we're living in a fraught time, if you will, right? There's a lot going on in the world with climate change, with the war in Ukraine, with, some of the kind of anti-social movements that are going on right now. But what I think that means is that, we are trying to build a more inclusive world. And we just have to keep going with it, because we need to make sure that that really is not just the vision of the future, but the reality.
Fantastic. May I turn it over to you, Teddy?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. And in a way, I'm glad that you spoke earlier and now, because one of the things I had noted when I was thinking about, in terms of where you put your money, clean energy to me is just where I think we should be investing massively. I just happened to be at a meeting yesterday on Canada-Germany relations, and there were many private companies there. And it's amazing the amount of work that they are currently doing in Canada to have clean energy, but these require massive amounts of investments. And of course, the government has an important role to play in this in terms of the subsidies and the regulatory framework and a lot of other things, but it's really about de-risking these investments. So I'm an economist, so I tend to look at these numbers very carefully. And I think this is the future, but of course there's a lot of uncertainty. And so the government will have to take these risks as we go forward. But for me, we were reminded yesterday and today about how important this is. So now there are other challenges which you've presented, and I think they are important as well. But I have to say, I tend to look at these issues more as from an international perspective. That's what most of my work has been. And of course, the challenges in the developing world, in the global south, are much more significantly higher than what we have here. I've spent a major part of my career as an academic looking at fragile states in particular, and also working on taxation and domestic resource mobilization. And I think these two, in my mind, are really important. I referenced a paper that I had written with one of my PhD students recently about the concentration of poverty and where we are going to be in 2030. And there's no question that it's going to be a fragile and conflict-affected states problem. If you want to meet that number one goal, which is zero poverty, you won't get there unless you address these countries. And here I come back to this issue of risk again, because these are the places where getting results historically have been the most difficult. And so are we willing to take chances in these countries? Because that's what we're going to have to do. We're going to fail in many cases, and there are many examples of this that we see: Afghanistan, Haiti right now, where we invested massive amounts of money, and there are many other countries. So the results are not easy to come by, but it doesn't mean we have to give up. I think we really need to have a long-term focus and engagement in these countries, which is sometimes difficult to sell, because people will say, well, why would you want to put your resources there? Well, this is where you have the most poor people in the world in an absolute sense. Nigeria is one of them, the DRC, and there's a list. You can look at the data. And then the other thing, in terms of the reason why I want to focus on domestic resource mobilization and taxation, is because we really need to think about resilience. It's good to invest, but I think it's also good to invest in places that will be able to support themselves afterwards. So we've looked at this over many years, and there are certain areas like helping countries tax better, build more efficient systems that can then create this accountability between governments and the people that they are trying to govern. Because unless you have that legitimacy being built, you will never have development, in my mind. So you need to have a political accountability between people who govern and those who are being governed. And that creates a really interesting combination that here in Canada and many rich countries we tend to take for granted. But in many other parts of the world, that bond simply does not exist. And so we need to build that so that then we don't have to constantly reinvest in terms of ODA funding in particular in these countries. So I will stop here and
Thank you so much.
I'll just add very quickly,
Please, yes.
I'm a big governance geek, and so everything you're saying resonates. And when I was Minister of International Development, was really focused on where can we make those particular governance investments, because if you don't have domestic resource mobilization, the state can't provide services, right? And if the state is not providing services, people don't have trust in the apparatus of the state. So I 100% agree.
Yeah, and I just sorry to
Please,
add on
yeah,
this
jump in.
because I,
Jump in.
would be remiss to point out kind of the issue of shrinking civic space. And the reality is you have kind of these two sides at play here. You have the investments in kind of the ability of these governments to, to deliver services, but you also have trends that are happening across the world where lack of ability for, like, even thinking about localization, thinking about the ability of a whole of society approach to exist, where that space is closing in many parts of the world. And so, I think, hats off to Canada in terms of kind of, community of democracy's leadership, championing the CSO, civil society enabling environment through the OECD DAC and so on. But I mean, the reality is when people show up to New York and we look at these voluntary national reviews, there is very little discussion in any of those VNRs. We participated in a review for many years on this issue of closing civic space. And one of the things that I worry about is, we're halfway through. I don't know if anyone remembers when we developed these goals. It was, 5 years before they ended. Everyone was talking about what's the next, kind of priority going to be. And the silence on these issues, like fragility around state accountability, around civic space, I think is really worrisome for, kind of the future of this agenda, and is a space where Canada has a lot of potential to further push and further lean in.
And I would say when I attended the first high-level political forum in New York in 2016, on behalf of Canada, like the number one thing I heard from civil society across the world was we need Canada's support.
Yeah.
Right? Like we need your allyship, we need your support, because your support of us gives us the confidence, but it also opens space for us in our own countries.
Canada has such an important role to play. I mean, we are the 6th wealthiest nation in the world, according to McKinsey, and we just have such an important role that we can play in making a difference. And, we can criticize the SDGs or say they're imperfect, which they definitely are, but when in history has that many countries, more than 190 countries come together to pledge their agreement in trying to achieve these lofty time-bound goals about making our planet a better place for our collective peoples on Earth. So it's an opportunity for us to stand up, and I think we're all thanking you for standing up for us. We have a few minutes to take some questions from the audience. So, all right, there's one right there.
Thanks everyone for your comments today.
Yeah.
Hear me?
Do we have a roving mic, please? Thank you.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Yes, so my question is for Minister Gould. So given your role in the implementation of the 2030 agenda, I was wondering, what have you learned during the first 7 years of that agenda? And how could the government of Canada do better in the second half of the 2030 agenda? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I love about the SDGs is that they apply to the whole world, right? It's the first time that when we've come together about development goals, we haven't just looked at the Global South. We've said, actually, this has to apply to everyone. And one of the things that I think Canada can be better at doing is actually learning from others in terms of, I think sometimes when I was in international development, like, I would go to another country and see what they're doing and go, oh my gosh, they're leapfrogging Canada, right? Because they don't have the legacy infrastructure and social infrastructure that we have. And, like, thank goodness we have it because it's provided for, so much. But then sometimes we get stuck in our ways, and it's really hard for us to kind of modernize and transform and get to a place where, we're delivering services for the 21st century, for 21st century people. And I think that, as Canadians, we are a humble people, but, we are a really wonderful country that has gotten a lot of things right. We've got a lot of things that we need to improve. And I think that, if there was a better way for us to see what other countries are doing, and not just like the typical countries, like not just the UK, Australia, the US, and New Zealand, which is a tendency that we have in Canada, but to say like, oh, let's look and see what they're doing in Kenya on, having electricity off the grid, or let's look at, what they're doing in Brazil with regards to social programming. Like, I think we can, or in Singapore, for example, with regards to delivering like pensions and employment insurance to their citizens. Like, let's actually have a more global outtake and take those lessons and those best practices from a much broader set of countries, and then see how we can apply them to the Canadian context. And then the other thing that continues to be, I think, a challenge for the government of Canada is this notion of a whole of government approach. We in a way have like 19th century departments, but we live in a 21st century world. And so there's a lot of silos, and we're breaking them down, right? But it's a lot of work to do that as the government. And it takes a lot of kind of like institutional firepower, if you will, to really break down those silos. I would say that on Monday, we had a press conference with regards to the Government of Canada's response to wildfires. And that was a really good example of a whole of government approach where, people across departments and across jurisdictions, right? Like across provinces, territories, municipalities, really like put those silos aside and said, like, this is how we're coming together to respond to something that is national in scope. But that's something we have to keep really working at in Canada. The pandemic was another pretty good example of, we were faced with a crisis and an emergency, and we couldn't use our traditional ways of doing things. We actually had to build something entirely new, and we did. And so I know we're capable of it, right? And so we have to keep thinking about how we can learn from others. We can be humble enough to say, like, maybe it's time for us to rethink about how we deliver things in a way that's better and more efficient and more effective for Canadians. And then the other thing that I would say is in the international context, so not looking at it internally, but looking at Canada's role in the world, is continuing to, and we are doing this, so I don't think it's something that we need to change, but I've been really proud of the way that we've stood up for civil society around the world, the way that we've stood up for feminist activists, for LGBTQ2 plus activists, for young activists right around the world, and we need to continue to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Another question? Maybe I'll just go to the back. Abbas?
Minister, always nice to see you back here amongst friends in the development sector. So I have a question. I want to pick on a couple of people in the audience. Teddy, I'll leave you out this time. Caitlin and Shannon, if I can direct my comment to you. We've heard from the minister that there's a keen interest in continuing to engage on the SDGs and really mobilize that whole of society approach. And that's also coupled with the notion of further investment, I hope. How, from both of your perspectives, should we consider investing those dollars to really advance our progress towards the 2030 and the ultimate achievement of the SDGs?
Oh, sure. I can go first. I think personally, like reflecting upon like my area of expertise, which is technically decolonization and gender equality, like really investing in Indigenous communities, doing that work already. We see that it works. So for my project, I work with a team of 6 Indigenous women and non-binary folks creating policy changes within their own community in the Arctic, which is really special. And I'm very thrilled to be able to do the work I get to do in the territory of which is my home. And we need more opportunities like that. We need to have money going, like Shannon said already, directly into communities that are already experts in what their home is, how things work, and want to create good changes in their homes that support the SDG work. Like part of the conversation I was hearing earlier today of like people don't know what that pin means. Because people don't see themselves reflected in the work that we do. Like I'm only 20 7 for like a couple more weeks. I have my first gray hair. And my mom had me quite young. My mom had me at 21. And when I told her, last week I'm sitting down with the minister, we're talking about sustainable development goals, my mom went, I don't know what that is. My mom is only 46 and, she's a pillar in our community. She takes care of elders and seniors and those folks know what they're doing. My mom knows what she's doing. She's doing number 17, if you will. But proper education and sustainable development goals, and also recognizing that Indigenous people have always been experts in sustainable development and in international cooperation. And so it's time for folks to also look at us for leadership and knowledge when it comes to how to do things in a good way.
And how to create space.
Yeah.
Okay, Shannon, hard act
Where
to
to
follow.
invest. Yes, it is always a hard act to follow when you speak, Caitlin. One of the points is investing. And, we heard from the parliamentary secretary this morning that there hasn't been a cut to ODA. We're probably going to have to agree to disagree on that. Just recognizing that, this year's budget is a smaller pie for investments in international cooperation than there was the year before. Recognizing that we were in an extraordinary circumstance of COVID-19, but I would argue we're still in an extraordinary circumstance. And as we look around the world and we look around the various crises, the various investments that need to be made, I would argue that there's a very strong case for Canada to kind of continue making those investments year on year to 2030 as has been the commitment. And I would say then within the sort of where those investments need to be made, there's something earlier today before you came, Minister, we were chatting, what does the next 12 to 18 months look like, in the Canadian context in terms of advancing this agenda? We talked a lot about how we communicate about these goals. One of the other things we talked about is about how do we kind of ring fence the legacy of women's rights, of civic space. We have examples like the Equality Fund, which is an excellent example of an initiative, but really just being quite honest about as we move into a world where there's ongoing crises, we're being hit in all ways, how do we hold space for reacting to the crises that are emerging, but also to those longer term investments that have already begun. And so I think, the Women's Voice and Leadership Initiative is a great example of direct funding to women's rights organizations. And so really thinking about those investments kind of in the years to come, both within kind of an increased budget for international development assistance, but also really thinking about what are those very localized investments that we would want to continue to make towards the SDGs.
Thanks. So one more question. Okay, I just wanted to take someone on the other side of the room, that's all. Yeah. Maybe the woman on the edge there.
Where am I going?
Over there. Sorry. Sorry. In these days and ages, we get to bring young women up front. Sorry.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It's been a really great conversation. So my question is for all the panelists. What do you believe should be prioritized for the remaining half of the 2030 agenda and why?
Okay, maybe I'm going to get you to start there, Teddy.
It's the $1 million question. One of the things that I used to do when I was teaching a development, which Robert now is teaching, which is my 8th class, I always started the course for a long time about with a question: if I gave each one of you $1 million, where would you spend it if you cared about development?
Nice.
And it's interesting, right? Because you get a lot of answers. I would say there's a different way to answer that question. And that was my objective, was not to necessarily ask them to think about a particular sector, but to think more about how they spend it and how they can be efficient in terms of how they spend it, and to think about the goal that they're trying to achieve. I think you had mentioned this, right? What is the objective that we're trying to achieve? If the goal is to get to zero poverty, then that's where the money should go. But one of the things that we also know with the SDGs and the way they are designed is that they are interdependent. And I don't think we spend enough time thinking about what I would call these interlinkages. And there's actually pretty good research on this now, where you can actually map out with a fairly good degree of precision what every dollar you spend, the multiplier effect it will have on other SDGs. So if you put money, for example, in clean energy, that's going to impact poverty. It's going to impact a lot of other things. Similarly, if you put money in quality education, it's going to have an impact on the other goals. So I think it's good for us for a question like this to step back and look at the context-specific nature of what you're trying to do, because each country is different. And that makes it really difficult, right? Because sometimes we tend to think, oh, we're going to have the same policy across the board. But I think that's the wrong way to think about it. It's really to look at the needs of these communities at the local level, or maybe even start at the country level and drill down and look at what is the biggest impact you can have with your dollar. To go back to your question, whether we like it or not, we don't have an infinite amount of money to spend. And Canada is a relatively small player in ODA. And so at one level, it's about maximizing the impact of what you do, but also making sure that you can use that to leverage. And I think in the afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about blended finance and financing the SDGs, which has always been a challenge, because ODA is nowhere near what we need to spend to get there. So I think the question should be looked at slightly differently, which is, what is your goal? What are you trying to achieve? And how do you make best use of that, as opposed to thinking about where you're going to spend it necessarily? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, do you
So,
want to jump
well,
in?
yeah, I mean, I think your point is a really good one. And it's also like we should talk more about the interdependence of the SDGs, because depending on the interventions that you make, they can have multiple impacts on different SDGs, right? And so, if you want to achieve zero poverty, well, what are the interventions that you're making that are going to reduce poverty, but at the same time, they might actually benefit life on land or life under the sea, because some of the things that people do that are having an impact in those areas are a direct result of living in poverty or being hungry, right? So I think there's a way to look at an intervention and say, how does this meet different SDG objectives? But I guess I would go back to your first point on governance, right? And on building resilient local governance that can deliver effective services for people. Because I think one of the things that I struggled with as Minister of International Development is, in many ways, the development community or international organizations supplanted local governance because they didn't have the tools and the resources to deliver those services. And so you want to make sure that people have access to healthcare and that they have access to, roads and good schools and all of these things. But I think we also need to spend more time and energy on building that local capacity and making sure that it is able to deliver those services locally. And when we're worried about democratic backsliding or the lack of space for civil society, all of that is related to not having good quality local governance, right? Because if people don't see themselves reflected in the taxes that they pay to receive the services that they are entitled to, then they don't necessarily believe that the form of governance that they have is the right one. And so I think tackling corruption, making sure that there is robust local governance structures is really important. And I think it's important to do it at the local level, because the municipal level is the one that people deal with on the most daily basis. Even here in Canada, the most complaints or criticisms that I get as the federal member of parliament are all municipal, right? And and it's those things, because that's the level of government that people interact with on the most frequent basis. Of course, I get criticisms at the federal level as well. Don't take me wrong. But on a day-to-day basis, when I get calls to my office, it's mostly about the local issues that affect people's daily lives. And so how do we strengthen that area? Because, I think you're right. ODA can't solve all these problems, but we don't want ODA forever either, right? Like we want to put ODA out of business because at the end of the day, we want local communities and countries to be able to be self-sustaining. So how are we taking those actions to help do that? Not from a directive point of view, but from a listening to the people on the ground point of view, what those needs are. And so I think that's a really important focus. And I mentioned in my remarks that the Prime Minister is co-leading with Mia Mottley from Barbados the kind of the UN initiative to try and raise the profile, but also raise funds for the SDGs around the world. And that's part of it, right? Is saying like, okay, we all have work to do internally, right? That is very much needed. But how do we mobilize the global community to say, how can we learn from each other? How can we mutually support each other? And how can we collectively achieve this objective? And yes, they're very lofty, right? Like they are very lofty, but someone told me yesterday that movements that believe are much stronger than movements that don't.
Exactly.
Right? And so, let us drive forward towards them, even if we don't achieve every single one of them perfectly by 2030, because we probably won't. But we need to make progress, right? And so having that path, that agenda towards progress, I think is what we want.
Thank you so much, Minister. Our time is up with you, and I'm just so grateful that we not only have you with us today, but we have you where you are positioned within our government. So thank you so much. Caitlin, Shannon, Teddy, thank you all so much, and thank you to everyone who's with us today.